urban land care is made
This
possible
meeting is being recorded
through the generous and ongoing support of Gaia College. So again, just to present our speaker today, at the beginning, this is the first session of the month-long sub-theme of our 2022 Year of the Ecological Garden webinar series. And the focus for the month of March, as I said before, is on trees in the urban environments. So today we have Sundaura Alford-Purvis, SOL's Executive Director, and also one of SOL's accredited practitioners. And she's going to be speaking to us today about the importance really of urban trees, but the fundamentals of the soil health that is responsible for a lot of the health of the trees. So over to you, Sundaura.
Hi, Christine, and thanks for doing that at the very last minute. I know we just realized that we couldn't for some reason reach the host who was scheduled for today, and things sort of had to get pulled together a little bit last minute. But hopefully you'll still get something useful out of this session, and we will continue with the scheduled theme of trees in urban settings. Trees are absolutely critical to our urban environment, our experience of it, but also the function of it. Before I get going too fast, is everybody actually seeing a picture on the screen share of a bunch of trees with a road down the middle? There was something glitchy. Christine, you look like you're nodding. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, good. Just because there was something glitchy that happened and I'm like, did the screen share work? So trees in our urban environment really affect our health, our well-being, our air quality, our urban temperatures. They can have a huge impact on how water moves through our urban soils, whether it flows off or flows down into. They are critical hosts for a huge range of species. Trees and woody plants that actually provide a lot of the food for a lot of caterpillars, which feed the nests, the nestlings, the hatchlings of so many of the songbirds that add so much to our experience of the space. They're a really big, impactful part of the ecosystem. But the part of the tree that we look at, the part on the top, is rarely the reason trees fail in urban settings. There can be issues where we end up removing them because we did a poor job of planning their location in relationship with buildings, or the location of buildings in the relationship of existing trees. And there can be poor pruning or other certain pest issues in that. But the biggest cause of failure of trees in urban spaces is actually to do with what's going on below ground. Our urban soils are often in quite poor health, and very often how we care for the ground layer below trees impacts the health of the trees and impacts even their roots' ability to properly breathe. It can often become excessively compacted. Some of our turf care can cause a lot of soil sort of breakdown of the biology, and it really limits the biology in the soil, which over time stresses the trees. And often we have a lack of consideration for just how, or even lack of awareness of how extensive root systems are when they're not being physically constrained by infrastructure, or how effectively roots can get into infrastructure and take it apart. So there can be various things where we really value the trees, but we actually don't provide them with the care they need. And one of the really important starting points for home gardeners, and even if you're sort of making choices about your own space as opposed to being in charge of large infrastructure decisions, is soil health. And something that often comes up when people are planting, a lot of gardeners when planting, and you can still find this in a lot of planting instructions provided by garden centers and places selling trees, is to enrich your soil, to actually change up its composition, which actually tends to limit the development of your tree's root structure rather than rather than encourage it to spread out to the scope that it is ideally going to spread to, and that would anchor the tree and feed it well over the long term. So first thing is, don't change the soil. Whatever your existing soil is, you want to work with that, but there are things you can do to improve the capacity for the plants to thrive, and the trees to thrive over time. And this picture I have up now with those 2 handfuls of soil is one where my husband is not much of a photographer, but I was like, you have to go grab the camera. I was moving some plants and I was taking some from an area that I've been caring for the soil for a couple of years and moving them into an area which had the same mineral soil, but I was just starting to work with that spot. And the difference in the soil between having a couple of years of care, of making sure it was watered, of putting some just wood chips on top, and sort of giving the plants what they needed to thrive, completely changed the appearance of the soil, even though it's the same mineral content. I didn't change out the soil. So plants will improve the soil if you give them a chance. And in urban spaces, one of the things that tends to really limit the capacity of trees to become established is actually compaction. And it's not just in urban spaces. There's been quite a bit of research. There was a Vineland study where they partnered with Vineland, Ontario. It's a research and horticulture and agricultural research body in Ontario. They partnered with Ministry of Transportation in Ontario and Alberta and did some research where they trialed out a bunch of different ways of planting trees along highways. And they found that it wasn't so much about the species of trees or the soil type when starting, or how you mulch them or anything else. It was, did you break up the soil compaction? And so they did it with the tractor with a deep sort of slicing blade that broke up the compaction, and they sort of did a grid, and then they worked some compost into those deep, up to 1 meter deep, if they could get the claws of the tractors in deep enough, and just broke up the soil and got some biologically active compost in it, so the soil could start recovering from all of the disturbance and compaction that happens through the road construction process, which is a lot like the compaction that happens in urban spaces. They broke up the compaction. They just spread some compost and then they planted the trees. And they found that they could plant young trees, they could plant mature trees, they could plant different species of trees, they could plant, all that mattered was, did they break up the compaction and did they add the biology back to the soil? After that, they could pretty much do any of the other things and the trees thrived, and it didn't matter what else they did. If they didn't break up the compaction, the trees struggled. So breaking up the compaction and adding some biological activity back to the soil, which you can do by adding compost and planting right away, or you can get the biological activity going by planting the area with especially annuals, first succession plants after you break the soil up. Then you can put down some wood chip mulch, plant it with fast growing species, the normal sort of first stage ones, and you can have that as like a cover crop for a year or two, and you can actually restore a lot of biological activity in soil just by doing that if you don't have access to a lot of compost. If you do want to find out what your basic soil type is, which is good to know because some trees thrive in primarily sands or predominantly sand soils, and some trees are actually very well adapted to heavy clay soils and lots of things in between. You can find out what your soil is just by doing a simple jar test. And I tend to encourage people to do that in urban areas, especially because compaction is very often presumed to mean clay soil. But because of the amount of physical activity that tends to happen in urban spaces, a lot of our soils are compacted completely unrelated to whether or not they have a high clay content. So doing a jar test, lots of places to find the instructions online. You can just shake up the jar once you've put the soil in and added the water, shake up the jar, let it settle, and then you use just a time thing to see how much how the sand settles out. I think it's 45 seconds, and then you give it an hour for the silt to settle, and then you do 24 hours for the clay to settle, and you see what your soil's actually made up of. And I find a lot of soils have a lot less clay than is often expected. And clay isn't inherently bad, but you just want to have a general idea of what the basic soil type is when you're selecting your trees. And that what I was saying about compaction, you can also see that in the structure, or the texture of your soil is that sand, silt, clay, which is what you'll find talked about in all the books and all the agricultural guides and all those things. Do you have sand or silt or clay? I've learned over the last several years that what the texture is much less important than what the structure is. And so when soil is compacted, it can't have air move through, doesn't have air move through it very well. Water doesn't soak in very well. The plants can't, their roots can't move through the soil very well. It has much less capacity to actually host a lot of biology. And it can't soak in nearly and hold on to nearly as much water. So building up that structure by providing the plants and the biology with a place to grow, and that's often where, even if you're dealing with really heavily compacted soil, spreading some fresh wood chips over the area for a season and growing a cover crop in it will do huge things to improve it if you don't have access to heavy equipment to break it up. Biology builds soil structure. Tilling it actually breaks it down. So you can break up soil by sort of slicing into it, but the more we till it, it's sort of like taking a loaf of bread and putting it through a blender. You actually end up with something that's a lot doughier and stickier and less fluffy in the end. Even if it seems like you're loosening the soil, tilling breaks up structure. So tilling is sometimes necessary to break up compaction, but if your soil has structure, encourage the continuation of that. Don't break it up. And when trees are growing in a lot of turf areas, there is often some compaction that happens. So when you have the opportunity, if you have the opportunity, and I understand it's not always the case, but if you can actually plant the areas below trees with ground covers that aren't for walking on, and then keep the sunnier, more open areas as turf, your trees will appreciate that. And all of the biology that feed, all of the critters that feed on their leaves will also have a place to complete their life cycle on the ground. And so urban spaces, the more area below the tree you can dedicate to the ecosystem that lives below the tree, the more your tree is going to thrive in the long term. So ground covers under trees, especially native mixed plant ground covers, you're going to start to create a really healthy ecosystem. We will always have some park areas, but the more you can sort of make some space around the base of the tree for the tree's sake, the healthier the tree is going to be, and the more they're going to be able to do to take care of us and the rest of the ecosystem. I hope that was useful. It was very quickly put together, but when it comes to soil health, that's a lot of what affects tree health in the long run. And the more we can care for the soil, the more the tree is going to be able to do to care for the whole ecosystem. So, anybody have tree questions?
All right, well, I, as host, am going to begin with a question. And then I encourage people to put a question in the chat if they'd like to ask it that way, or else signal that you would like to ask Sundaura directly and we can unmute you. So my question, well, first of all, I really like that point about, as much as you can dedicate to the understory of the tree that serves the ecosystem, the better. We have so much experience in our urban environments where it really is just turf and trees. It's a common aesthetic, common look that we have. And yeah, there's more people writing about that. Douglas Tallamy, he's big on talking about the caterpillars that come down and really need that ecosystem. So can you describe some of, well, maybe it's not always just very specific, but are there certain ground covers that you find that work well under trees that serve that purpose?
So I tend to go ecosystem more than specific plants. So sort of, as I was saying, start with the soil type when you're selecting your trees. And if you find out you have clay soil, there's trees that thrive in that. If you find out you have a sandy soil, and then look at the ecosystem, because if you're in a really, if it's a dense setting where there's a lot of trees and there's a lot of shade, then I would say look to an actual forest, like mature forest ecosystem, and the species that would naturally grow underneath those trees. And there's some really beautiful spring ephemerals that are native to where I am in Ontario, where you can get some just beautiful blankets of cover underneath the trees. And you do want to be sure to leave the leaves as well, because the actual forest species are really reliant on that. So, there's the classic, like the trilliums and things like that, but also there's woodland phlox, if you can track it down. It's notoriously hard to source, which is really weird to me because it's such a wonderful, resilient, easy to grow plant. There's some awesome woodland goldenrods, like zigzag goldenrod and blue stem goldenrod, which are incredibly hardy, late blooming, dry shade tolerant plants that are really showy and not aggressive spreaders. So as somebody who worked as a landscape designer for years, I was always struggling for fall blooming plants in dry shade. And then I eventually discovered that there's goldenrods that bloom in dry shade. There's also some lovely native asters. There's big leaf aster, and it's quite a large, thick leaf. It makes a really dense ground cover in some of the most difficult spots, and has pretty sort of pale pink to pale purple blooms in the late fall. Heart-leaved aster is just gorgeous. They're just so showy when they bloom, and again, will grow in dry shade. You can put those with Canada wild ginger. You can add some bloodroot for some early spring bloom. Squirrel corn, which is a native dicentra, likes if you have a little bit of moisture and really good leaf cover, it's a beautiful spring ephemeral. There's the trout lilies, and the spring ephemerals actually do a really neat thing in the ecosystem, in that they actually, a lot of the nutrients that are released as that forest litter is starting to break down and the spring melt, they actually capture the nutrients that might otherwise run off, hold them, and then they release a bunch of nutrients when they go dormant in the summer that the trees take back up. So they actually keep the nutrients in the ecosystem. If you're dealing with an area that is more open, where you've got some more sun, then that's sort of more woodland, which I think is what you find most often in urban settings, because we have a tree in a space and a tree in a space and a tree in a space, which have a huge amount of flexibility. And then you can also start to add some of the understory species. If you need sort of mid-sized trees to add in, things like pagoda dogwood are gorgeous, native to sort of the eastern half of the country. Understory tree. There's some of the wild raspberries, the flowering raspberries, have a big maple leaf shaped leaf. There's a western and an eastern version of that, so they can sort of get them coast to coast. There are lots of Bernardas that will grow in part shade, and again, they're sort of widely distributed. But there's also lower growing plants, and actually even some we tend to not think of as ground covers, but are actually really neat as ground covers, like the self-healed prunella. I've actually started to really love it as a sort of the native one's about a foot tall, makes a beautiful ground cover. If you're looking for dense ground covers, Canada anemone will fill as much space as you could possibly want. So there's a lot of plants that will thrive under trees. They'll do better than the turf wood. They'll give you a whole bunch of color. They'll support a whole bunch of pollinators. And then when you do your spring or your fall or spring cleanup of the lawn, you just rake all the leaves into the garden, you're done.
Yeah. Well, Phil is wondering if you have any recommendations specifically for spruce trees.
Under spruce trees. So as long as there's some light, spruce tend to make the soil a little bit acidic, and as long as you're leaving the needles, you'll start to get conditions that will support some of the plants actually I can't grow very well in my place. So you can grow like wintergreen, you can grow partridge berry, you can grow It's my logo. You'd think I'd remember it's the logo for my business. Bunchberry, the little the herbaceous little, it's dogwood actually. Cornus, is it Cornus canadensis? My brain's sort of fritzing on me at the moment, but the little bunchberry makes a beautiful ground cover if you've got the good spots for it. And a lot of those spring ephemerals, like the squirrel corn, as long as there's some moisture in the spring, they're quite adapted because they'll use that moisture in the spring and then go dormant in the summer. So there are plants that actually need the acidity that you tend to get below evergreens. The biggest challenge below a dense evergreen canopy is often the water. So if you are in an urban setting, we often treat rainwater as waste. We try to shed it off as fast as possible. Point it towards the trees if you can. Give them the excess water. So if you have downspouts or means of moving water away from buildings but towards the plants, if you can get water underneath, it doesn't have to be tons of water, but just so it's not bone dry underneath evergreens, there are actually quite a few plants that will tolerate the acidity that you find under evergreens. It doesn't have to be hostas. And actually the big leafed aster is also actually really tolerant. And there's white wood aster. It's also quite closely related to the big leaf aster that will also tolerate the acidity that you find under evergreens. And those two actually form quite a nice ground cover and don't get terribly tall. Even when they're in bloom, they're only about, the foliage stays sort of just about 6 or 8 inches high.
Okay, so another question for me, but yeah, as I said, please feel free to put your questions in. And that is when you mentioned adding biologically active soil. I remember in a presentation that Astrid gave about the Little Forest on Wolf Island, so a previous presenter in this series, and she was working in the Little Forest idea, which is really dense planting in the hopes that, well, the theory that the trees will grow very quickly. But one thing they did when they were doing the soil preparation was add, I think it was a tablespoon of soil from a mature hardwood forest that was ethically sourced. So I just was wondering if you could speak to that, first of all, about how do you ethically source that type of soil from a mature hardwood forest? And also, what is the value of a teaspoon of that soil that's from a healthy wood, a forest, and then placing that into a new forest that's being planted?
Yeah, so as far as ethically harvesting, yeah, I kind of think if you're planting a new forest, taking a bucket of soil from an old forest is kind of like taking seeds to go and plant another ecosystem. You are doing a great deal of net positive because it's kind of like if you've ever made yogurt and you just have like the little itty bit of starter and it makes a whole yogurt, and then you can actually take some of that yogurt and make another yogurt and make another, just like doing sourdough. Or for some reason I have trouble starting kimchi from scratch in my kitchen, but I take about a quarter of a cup and I add it to a great big another batch of kimchi and it works like a charm. So in taking, because we have broken up the forest ecosystems, and we're naturally, an ecosystem as it spreads tends to sort of spread out, and the biology spreads along with the plants. So it just goes out. But we can take the seeds or take cuttings or that and transport them and not take what they would be growing in and all the biological partners they have in that soil. And so they're kind of, we're taking them away from their community. And this is also, it's also why I always say, what would normally grow with that tree? When any time somebody asks me about what would you plant with, and I always go, well, first thing I would do is start to go, where does that species normally live? Because they probably have partnerships. We don't know most of what is in the soil. We've only really just started to understand is once genetic testing got cheap, because we can't culture most of this in lab culturing settings, but we can now genetically test and find out what all the genetics are in a sample. And it's just, there's so much in there. We don't know what most of it does. We do know that most of those trees are evolved growing in partnership with most of these soil, most of the soil biology, most of this fungi, most of this bacteria. And actually, for sheer numbers, the number one thing in soil is actually viruses, apparently, which we know almost nothing about, and they don't seem to be the viruses that have a sort of relationship with mammals. So they're kind of, we're not worried about them, but there's huge quantities of them. We have no idea what they do from an ecosystem standpoint. But we do know that those trees have existed with them for a long time. And we also know that they exist in absolutely massive quantities in the soils. So a bucket of soil with a little bit put with each plant is just like that starter. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't be out like say go out to 2 forests without permission and just take soil, but there's so much good that's done from taking a little bit of soil away from a healthy ecosystem, that the ecosystems, if they're thriving and healthy, is not going to collapse because a bucket or two of soil was taken away. And once your new forest is up and going and thriving, you can also take a little bit from that and a little bit from that. So you're actually increasing the availability. So when we talk about resources, you want a renewable resource, soil fungi is right near the top. So yes, ask permission of whoever holds the deed, and ask permission of the ecosystem. But it's very much like going into a big full patch of, well, there was like Joe Pye weed where I went around and I took a pinch off each flower head and I still ended up with like a whole bag. There's so much abundance that if we're using it to actually help bring back the connections, that's a renewable activity, because you're actually increasing rather than decreasing the availability and the quantity of what you're taking. And there's not too many places where we actually get to do that.
Yeah. All right. Does anyone have a question? I'd like to put it in the chat. Because I have another one as well. So just
Go for it.
In terms of, like, we see a shift these days. We see a shift in terms of the garden aesthetic, in terms of the concern that people have for what's happening. We just heard the climate change report came out. We've got huge issues with, changing climate and biodiversity loss as well. And that's sort of part and parcel of that. But can you speak to the idea that, that these spaces that we have that we're able to work in, so that they could be private homes and they could be public spaces, but just the importance of educating and awareness of this? And where do you think we're at with that? Where do you think that the average person, are we doing enough? Like, where are the areas that we can influence? Is it through the work that SOL members do in private practice, or is it meant to be, should we be doing this through schools as well? We need more literacy, it seems to me, for these types of understandings, how ecosystems work, but also how we can influence our own public spaces. But what do you think is the most important thing that society at large has to contend with right now and start applying? And where do we get that knowledge? How do we keep building it in society?
That's not a small question.
That's not a small question, but
so there's a few things there. I think it's important to have this in schools, but by the time those kids grow up, it's going to be decided either way. As the IPCC report yesterday made pretty clear, it's not the kids, it's us right now. It's the things we do right now, not what the kids do once we tell them about these things and then ask them to come up with solutions. We need to be implementing changes right now. And there are changes being implemented. And one of the things, because I've been through the whole climate despair cycle, where you're just like, that's it, like there's no chance. And then I did sort of find some glimmers of hope when it comes to just the sheer capacity for ecosystems to regenerate. And that's been sort of the first source of wonder I really discovered with this was when I was like 4 years old and I tried to find out seeds turn into plants. best magic ever, never stop being magic, still makes me giddy 40 years later. But not only do seeds turn into plants, when we give ecosystems half a chance, the speed at which they regenerate, how quickly forests, we don't even have to replant forests, we just have to give them the space to replant themselves, and they come back so quickly. We actually in a lot of ways don't have to do the work of fixing. We actually have to do the work of learning how to have lives and livelihoods that don't require the harm, because as soon as the harm stops, the regeneration is just incredible. So we do still need to be as people. And so I'm not on the, well, there's just too many people bandwagon. I think we're sort of at quite the flow, the ebb and flow of population, but I don't think population is the conversation to have. I think actually how we make our decisions and what we consider when we make those decisions. And so I think there's tons of livelihood work that can happen in caring for the ecosystems in our communities. And I think that's where Gaia College does so much training, and where Soul is trying to sort of help support people who are doing that work through our communications and highlighting what our members do, because I think we need examples of how to actually have a livelihood that cares for ecosystems and actually does some of the work of repairing. And I don't think it's going out to other places and repairing. I think it's actually seeing and cultivating that relationship with what a healthy ecosystem is in the spaces where the people are. And so that's the urban side. And so there's skills that we need for sort of making the decisions about what we do in our lives and what we do for our livelihoods, and whether we are focusing on proving to ourselves, the ecosystem, our neighbors, that we have dominated and mastered the landscape. 20 years in the horticultural industry, I eventually clued in that was the core of the work. So we've done that work of, it's been all about all this dominating the ecosystem. And that's culturally tied in as well. So we do communicate something for that domination. So if we shift to caring for an ecosystem, and we can find livelihoods and tell the story of those livelihoods, then I think we can actually make some more space to have care-based conversations in different livelihoods. We can actually start to sort of carve out some room for what does well look like, because I look at things like that IPCC report saying, this is all, we're missing on everything, it's all wrong. And also, green tech isn't going to save us. And I'm like, I think lots of people are at the point of going, yes, we need to change. But what I almost never see in all these things is actually good steps to what does your day-to-day life, what is your livelihood in an actually sustainable future? There's so little about that out there. And I think we need more examples of work that is about caring for as opposed to dominating. And I think that can carry through so many aspects of society, that we can't fix everything ourselves with plants, but boy, oh boy, can we provide some really good examples.
Yeah. Well, and when you say caring, it also just reminds me it's community as well, and being human, but being part of also that plant and animal world as well, and seeing ourselves as a part of it. But let's get back to a more practical question, and that is from Nick. Do you have any advice for when a large urban tree has to go for safety reasons, ecologically speaking?
So yes, ecologically speaking, about safety reasons, they're actually two different things, right? Because the safety is the human, and I don't object to that. I do think as humans, we do have sort of a right to a bit of a habitat and some safe spaces. I think part of it is often lessons learned of, do we actually pay attention to how the tree and human safety came into conflict, and could we have made better decisions leading up to that point? Because sometimes we are in a position where unless you're going to exclude humans from an area while the tree slowly sort of fails, to ensure that nobody is injured. And hey, that might be an option. If you have a park and you can go, they did that with the giant oak tree that broke here in Ottawa. They put a fence around it. They kept it as long. I think it might be down now, but they kept, it's just
the
like
beds at the Arboretum. Yeah, that one. Yeah,
it's like everybody stay back because the tree's going to eventually fall over the rest of the way. You can do that if that's possible, but sometimes these things aren't possible and we do end up needing to remove. So can you start to restore some other sort of aspect of forested ecosystem in that space? Are there any plants that need to be rescued? Is there a healthy biology under that tree? Can you then take a bunch of that and use it so when you're starting a bunch of other plants? What can be saved would be sort of what lessons can be learned, what can be saved. Can everything from that tree find another space? Can it not become waste, but can it become something? Can all the chips end up going down in your new planting area under the tree that needed to be removed? So it's not that we don't alter ecosystems. And actually, when it comes to, I see so much about we have to save the trees, and this month's theme is trees. But actually, we also have to save the wetlands, and we have to save the grasslands, and we have to save the woods, and we have to save all of these ecosystems have a role, and trees sometimes die. And what happens to that space afterward is part of the story of that tree. So I take it out of being just a one-off situation. What's the story that came before? What are the lessons so that we don't have to remove a tree that otherwise should be allowed to stay, so that we don't end up in that position again? How do we respect the life of that tree and also all the life that tree supported? And how do we get the next generation going? Because these things cycle. If you have time, can you save some, whatever the seeds are from that tree, to grow out some more? There's lots of, there's ways of sort of treating the tree as an individual, but also as part of the ecosystem. And those are the questions I tend to ask. So I don't know if that answered your question, because there's so many directions you could run from what do you do when a large tree needs to be removed because of safety? So ecologically speaking, cycle as much of it as possible back into the ecosystem, rescue as much of the biology as you can. There might be soil that could be rescued. There might be seeds that could be rescued. There might be plants under it that are not going to thrive now that the tree is gone, that could be moved elsewhere. You can help the ecosystem on to its next stage. Those are all things that ecologically I would recommend.
Well, I know that I've been one where a sugar maple was being, I guess, trimmed across the street. But I remember asking, can I take some of the, not very large pieces, but just scattered them around the beds in my garden? Because it was all going to go away. So it was never an option for that homeowner to sort of say, no, please keep some of this and spread it around. But I was taking some stuff. Oh yeah, so Nick just he just responded to say, that's perfect, thanks. It was just leaning toward a neighbor's house, misplanted. So yeah, that's an example of some of the ways that planting itself has a big impact. And what is your opinion, Sundaura, about planting? Or maybe you can respond to that, but also small trees or larger trees. Like, there's so much about the industry about how trees are growing in nurseries, and I know you're a seed saver, seed collector. And so what are your thoughts then about encouraging people to do more of the planting from seed? There's the sort of, people want, bigger species sometimes, but what are your thoughts about the planting of different sizes and ages?
So if you're buying a tree, don't buy a tree in a pot. it's kind of one of those dirty industry secret things that is not really a secret if you really go looking, but everybody knows, and some people are trying some things, but there isn't really a solution. You grow a tree in a pot, its roots do this. And that's not a big deal when they're young, but those roots get thicker, and it's severely limiting the lifespan of large trees. Especially maples are hugely susceptible to this, but I've seen lindens suffer from it. I've seen lots of large trees. If they've been grown in what's called pot and pot production, in pots at all, but what the big nurseries do now is they bury empty pots in a field and they run the irrigation, and then they drop a pot into the pot with the tree in it into the pot, and they hook up the irrigation, and they're really easy to ship, and they can use lighter weight potting materials, got a lot of bark in it, so they're easier to transport. If you can buy a tree that was field grown, which are often the ball and burlap ones, although even that, unfortunately, some of them are starting their lives in pots and then going out in fields. So, excuse me, if you know what the grower was and you can find out that it was definitely field grown for its whole life cycle, like pruned up from and as a young seedling, good root system planted into a field grown on and then root balled and shipped, they're going to have a properly shaped root structure for long lifespan. But that can be hard to find out. So honestly, I would buy younger bare root trees whenever possible, and it's amazing how fast trees can grow from seed. You can actually plant trees from seed. You can plant them in spot, and I've seen examples of like 12-year-old oak trees that had been grown from acorns, and they had the trunks on them like this, and they looked like these beautiful, perfect nursery trees. So there's somebody down in the States, I see their Facebook posts every so often about grow trees from seed, darn it, it's free. They were showing something they planted a whole bunch of oak trees with school kids in a park, and it just looked like this beautiful patch of perfect oak trees. And they'd all just been planted for free as acorns. So the younger than you can buy the tree, the better it's going to adapt, and the better structure root system is going to have, so it's going to have a longer lifespan. And the roots are really the do or die part of trees. They need to be able to spread out. So as far as the other aspect of size of trees, pay attention to what the 40, 50, 60-year size of a tree is. If you need to, get a smaller species. If it's just not going to fit in the space and it's going to have to get cut down as a 30-year-old tree, they aren't going to be able to do all those wonderful, amazing things that trees do when they grow up, when it comes to how much air they can filter and how much water they can filter and how much they can photosynthesize and feed all that energy into the ecosystem. Most of them do it not as teenagers, but as adults. And so smaller tree, you will be able to do more in a smaller space over time. So sometimes go with the smaller species, because our yards in urban spaces can be awfully small. But also, if it has the root span, plant a big tree. There's few things you can do that will do more good in an urban ecosystem than planting the biggest tree that will fit the space that is native to the area. Huge amount of good will do for the ecosystem, and then plant a native garden underneath, and you just get to sort of sit back and admire all the life that you've helped support.
Well, that's a wonderful ending to this session, because we have hit the mark for the time. But Sundaura, you did a really good job of just coming in at that last minute, just because we hadn't managed to secure the presenter for today. So I want to thank everybody for coming and joining this conversation, just being part of this whole series. It's really going to be wonderful to see how it develops over the whole year. But this month, as we said, is the month that we're focusing in on trees in urban ecosystems, urban environments. And so for the next 3 sessions, we will come back with the presenters that we've been organizing. So Sundaura, thank you very much for this, and thank you all for coming. Okay.
You're a host, so you'll need to end meeting.
Okay, so I will end the meeting now and I'll stop the recording.
Thanks.